what I'm also fascinated by is metrics that are different than engagement. So the other thing from an alien perspective, what social networks are doing is they in the short term bring out different aspects of each human being. So first, let me say that an algorithm or a social network for each individual can bring out the best of that person or the worst of that person. Or there's a bunch of different parts to us, parts we're proud of that we are, and parts we're not so proud of. When we look at the big picture of our lives, when we look back 30 days from now, am I proud that I said those things or not? Am I proud that I felt those things? Am I proud that I experienced or read those things or thought about those things? Just in that kind of self-reflective kind of way. And so coupled with that, I wonder if it's possible to have different metrics that are not just about engagement, but are about long-term happiness, growth of a human being, where they look back and say, I am a better human being for having spent 100 hours on that app. And that feels like it's actually strongly correlated with engagement in the long term. In the short term, it may not be, but in the long term, it's like the same kind of thing where you really fall in love with a product. Mm-hmm. You fall in love with an iPhone, you fall in love with a car. That's what makes you fall in love, is like really being proud and just in a self-reflective way, understanding that you're a better human being for having used the thing. And that's like where that's what great relationships are made from. It's not just like you're hot and that we like being together or something like that. It's more like I'm a better human being because I'm with you. And that feels like a metric that could be optimized for by the algorithms. But anytime I kind of talk about this with anybody, they seem to say, yeah, okay, that's going to get outcompeted immediately by the engagement, if it's ad driven, especially. I just don't think so. I mean, a lot of it's just implementation.
I'll say a couple of things. One is to pull back the curtain on daily meetings inside of these large social media companies. A lot of what management, or at least the people that are tweaking these algorithms, spend their time on are trade-offs. And there's these things called value functions, which are like, okay, we can predict the probability that you'll click on this thing, or the probability that you'll share it, or the probability that you will leave a comment on it, or the probability you'll dwell on it. Individual actions, right? And you've got this neural network that basically has a bunch of heads at the end, and all of them are between 0 and 1, and great, they all have values, right? Or they all have probabilities. And then in these meetings, what they will do is say, well, how much do we value a comment versus a click versus a share versus and then maybe even some downstream thing, right? That has nothing to do with the item there, but like driving follows or something. And what typically happens is they will say, well, what are our goals for this quarter at the company? Oh, we want to drive sharing up. Okay, well, let's turn down these metrics and turn up these metrics. And they blend them, right, into a single scalar with which they're trying to optimize. That is really hard, because invariably you think you're solving for, I don't know, something called meaningful interactions, right? This was the big Facebook pivot. And I don't actually have any internal knowledge. Like, I wasn't in those meetings, but at least from what we've seen over the last month or so, it seems by actually trying to optimize for meaningful interactions, it had all these side effects of optimizing for these other things. And I don't claim to fully understand them, but what I will say is that trade-offs abound. And as much as you'd like to solve for one thing, if you have a network of over 1 billion people, you're going to have unintended consequences either way. And it gets really hard. So what you're describing is effectively a value model that says, like, can we capture, this is the thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, can you capture utility in a way that like actually measures someone's happiness, that isn't just a, what do they call it? A surrogate problem, where you say, well, I kind of think like the more you use the product, the happier you are. That was always the argument at Facebook, by the way. It was like, well, people use it more, so they must be more happy.
Yeah.
turns out there are like a lot of things you use more that make you less happy in the world. Not talking about Facebook, just, let's think about whether it's gambling or whatever, like that you can do more of, but doesn't necessarily make you happier. So the idea that time equals happiness, obviously you can't map utility and time together easily. There are a lot of edge cases. So when you look around the world and you say, well, what are all the ways we can model utility? There's like one of the, please, if you know someone smart doing this, introduce me because I'm fascinated by it. And it seems really tough. But the idea that reinforcement learning, like everyone interesting I know in machine learning, like I was really interested in recommender systems and supervised learning. And the more I dug into it, I was like, oh, literally everyone smart is working on reinforcement learning. Like literally everyone.
You just made people at OpenAI and DeepMind very happy, yes.
But what's interesting is like, it's one thing to train a game and like, that paper where they just took Atari and they used a ConvNet to basically just like train simple actions, mind-blowing, right? Absolutely mind-blowing. But it's a game. Great. So now, what if you're constructing a feed for a person, right? Like, how can you construct that feed in such a way that optimizes for a diversity of experience, a long-term happiness, right? But that reward function, it turns out in reinforcement learning, again, as I've learned, like reward design is really hard. And I don't know, like how do you design a scalar reward for someone's happiness over time? Do you have to measure dopamine levels? Like, do you have to?
Well, you have to have a lot more signals from the human being. Currently, it feels like there's not enough signals coming from the human being users of this algorithm. So for reinforcement learning to work well, it needs to have a lot more data.
It needs to have a lot of data. And that actually is a challenge for anyone who wants to start something, which is you don't have a lot of data. So how do you compete? But I do think, back to your original point, rethinking the algorithm, rethinking reward functions, rethinking utility, that's fascinating. That's cool. And I think that's an open opportunity for a company that figures it out.